First of all, welcome. This is the an inclusive Sussex in conversation event, in case you think you're somewhere else, or you're planning to go to a different meeting. You're all very welcome. In a moment, we'll do some introductions, but I just wanted to say one or two things about what we're doing this evening. So you may know this, but Inclusive Sussex in Conversation is something that we started when we refreshed the Inclusive Sussex strategy last year. Last year. And this is the third of the series. And the idea is that we invite esteemed guests to have a conversation around some issue or theme in any way whatsoever, broadly or narrowly defined, relating to equality, diversity and inclusion. And this evening's session, this evening's conversation is around inclusive leadership. I think that there is filming going on, so I don't think you're being filmed, but it might be useful for you to know that in case you want to be filmed or not be filmed. The structure of the event is that it is a conversation. So this isn't an interview. Imagine Graham Norton. Not nearly as good as that, but it's that sort of thing, or we might be even better than Graham Norton. It is a conversation. So we have prepared some themes that we want to talk about. It's not going to be heavily scripted. And each of us will chip in as and when we think we've got something useful to say. So I think it's, my name is David Rubin. I should have said this at the beginning. I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Culture, Equality and Inclusion. I'm going to invite Zahira and Ben to introduce themselves first, and then we'll move on to our guest. So, Zahira.
My name is Lela Johnson. I am a senior lecturer at the school. Before being a senior lecturer, I was an investment banker for many years. So I lived in organizations where diversity was interesting. And so it would be great to speak about it. And of course, I think diversity in study. Be great to speak. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Ben.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Everly. I'm a senior lecturer in organizational behavior at business school at Sussex. And my research and some of my teaching is all about diversity in organizations. I'm trained as a social psychologist. So really it's intergroup relations in general that I find most fascinating. I'm particularly interested in people disclosing concealable, stigmatized identities. So for example, sexual orientation. So what makes someone decide when it's safe and when they want to come out in different contexts, and then how do other people react to that, and how does it change the interaction in their behavior? So thank you very much for the invite.
Thanks, Ben. So I'm going to invite Lela and Jane to give a bit of a longer introduction. You may not know them. So Lela, maybe you can say something about your background first. Yeah, as a leader, because you're both
leader or as a human being. I'm going to start with as a human being. So I think one of the things that's relevant to me in the space of inclusion is that I came to the UK when I was 7 years old and as a refugee from the Afghan War. Most of you will never have heard of it, and certainly not been born when it was happening, but that had a big influence on the way that I saw the world and the way that inclusion played out in my life. So that was that. The second significant thing for me was being active in the anti-apartheid movement, which I joined in 1986. So that was a key moment for me, and maybe talk about that. It might come up, it might not, in terms of fighting and winning battles about inclusion and equality. And then I had a career as an accountant in local government, which was very exciting. And my last sort of full-time paid job was as Assistant Chief Executive at Islington Council, where I had responsibility for a load of random things ranging from art to employment support to youth offending. But included in my portfolio was responsibility for qualities. And it was an interesting struggle to decide whether to bother to do that. I thought, I'm a senior black person, now they want me to do this, am I going to take it? I did take it because I cared about the issue, but I did think it was a bit like, but there were that in terms of organisation behaviours, equality policies, oh my God, I've got a lot to say about those. And then when I did work with the Department of Education, and then for NHS England, relating to COVID inequalities and disability and health and employment and so on. And then I founded Black Pride Global, which is an organisation that seeks to address the inequalities, systemic issues that lead to Black people being disproportionately mentally well, and which is not just about health, but everything that happens throughout life. And I was with Black Pride up to July this year, July 23, and I now co-lead for an organisation called Case Matters, which seeks to accelerate change in places, generally taking a stance around equity. That was quite long, actually.
No, that's good. I think it says now I've got those bits, so I've
All right.
But I've got another question for you, James. So, I mean, and you answered it partly, but I wondered what it, and there's a panorama of experience there. And I wonder if you might say something about the evolution from, so maybe not as far, or maybe from when you came to in Nigeria, but how you've seen changes from the perspective of leadership.
How I've seen changes around me.
Around inclusion.
Around inclusion.
Yeah.
I think there's been a revolution in, well, maybe not revolution, but there's been a huge amount of change. And I think your lecture, David, actually, for me, was a great summary of the change, because it's easy to forget the change that's come. So certainly when I was a child, I was called the N-word routinely. Every single day, we got half portions of, I got half portions as activities of food for the dinner ladies at primary school. It was just normal. That was a long time ago. And I now know that would be, actually, I'm very confident that would not happen. So there's been a huge change. And I think 2020 post-George Floyd was another moment. But actually there have been loads of moments, which I think your lecture does actually cover, the fact that people have fought and won. And that's the thing that really stays with me in terms of age. It's easy to think, oh, will change, but it's almost the people who have fought to say it doesn't change, because they fought, but some people gave their lives.
Thanks, Lela. We'll come back to some of those things. Sure. Jane, something about your background and how you came into this work of leadership and.
Great. Well, I too am delighted and feel privileged to have this conversation. So I was born in Liverpool to a large Irish Catholic family in the late 50s. And I was very aware that we had some books in the house, and that was quite a privileged family to be in those days and in where I was brought up. And so that's one thing. I was aware that actually being Catholic in Liverpool was being part of the largest club. It's not true in most places in the UK, but it's true in Liverpool at that time. I was then, I went away to university. I was the first and indeed only child of one of 5 children who went to university, and I felt very intimidated by going to university because I didn't have lots of people who'd been there and all of that. I then became a teacher. My dad had come back from the Second World War, unqualified. He went when he was 18 and he came back when he was 25 with no education, no anything. And like lots of men in that generation, were then pushed into work without any degrees or qualifications, and he became a special educational lead teacher. So that, for me, that was the biggest, hottest thing that I could imagine being. And then I became a school teacher, and I was a teacher in Hackney. I loved being a teacher in Hackney. And what I realised was, if I didn't understand students in terms of socioeconomics, in terms of their ethnicity, in terms of their sex, gender, disability, neurodivergence, and indeed every aspect of their life, I could not be a great teacher. And then I took that idea and thought, well, it's not only about being in my little classroom getting it right, it's also about the school as an institution, and then education, and then I became a lecturer, as around colleges, and then I thought, well, actually, it's not only about education, is it? It's about every single organisation taking appropriate account of difference. And then, so I was in an FE college, actually, and then I met somebody called Dr. Annie Hen, she's brilliant. And she and I thought, well, we can't do the work we want to do here, so we're going to have to set. So I had no intention, I had no background in business, I'd done no marketing, no careful analysis of whether it could fly, because I thought, well, I can always go back to teaching to pay the gas bill. Anyway, so 30 years later, we ran this company, it's called Quality Works, and then so I sold it 2 years ago, and to a company that does work in lots of diversity and inclusion, and I now specialise in leadership and working with boards and senior people. But basically, we go in and we say to, sometimes organisations come in and come to us when terrible things are happening and you're reading about it in the papers. We go up, roll our sleeves up, mop and bucket, and then work with them to make sure that doesn't happen again. And on a more positive entrance would be into an organisation would be, we see this, we want to get this right, help us get this right. So that's what we do. That's I came out to my mid-20s, which was not a great conversation to have with my Irish Catholic mother, and we eventually recovered our relationship. And what else to say? Oh, in Liverpool, it was very segregated on race lines. And there's an obvious history there, but basically black communities lived in certain parts of Liverpool and white communities lived in other parts. And that's I noticed it, and that's part of my thinking and being aware of my privilege.
Thanks, Jane.
That was definitely.
Very interesting. I need it. I've got it. Thank you. So I also want to invite you, Jane, to give any reflections, as Lela has done, on changes. If you were to think about the state of inclusion and leadership now compared to then.
Well, I agree with Lela. There's a long way to go. There's all kinds of awfulness. My focus has been on organisational settings. But I mean, really, when I was growing up, there used to be a big yellow bus, and it had ESN on the side of it. And what that stood for was educationally subnormal. Hands up those who would want to put their children onto that bus. So in terms of language, it's changed. It's not a long way to go, as Lela says, but there's hardly any legislation. No legislation about disability at all. There's 1944 Act.
Yeah.
I would, by the way, echo Lela again to say, listen to David's inaugural lecture, because it gives the arc of change very elegantly. So loads of awfulness now. I'm not naive. I'm sure nobody in this room is naive, but my goodness, there is progress. And we need to hold on to that. Otherwise, we don't get up in the morning. We have to believe in the possibility of change. And I've witnessed that and experienced it, and I'm sure many of you have had. That doesn't mean that I'm thinking everything is wonderful.
Thanks, Jane. So our first theme, if we're going to do it this way, is identity at work. And I'm going to invite any of you really to give your thoughts about your experience of how you are present at work. So for some people, they may be open about their identities. For others, they may hide it. Does it work to be open? Are there contingencies which one should take into account? What does that bringing yourself to work mean? Who'd like to kick off?
Okay, all right, that's interesting. I've got multiple identities, and also identities in some way. And when I was young, I used to, when I went back to Nigeria when I was 15, I was part of what became the Don't Belong group, or who don't belong, so to speak. And part of it was being across different cultures, and in addition to that, I came out as a lesbian in what year was it? I can't remember. A long time when I was 25, 26, something like that, maybe a bit older. And what I've noticed in terms of bringing myself to work is that I'm black, that is obvious. So I don't need to come out about being black, but certainly coming out as gay it was relatively easy, but I'm not 100% out in every situation at work. And when I was in Islington, working in Islington Council, I noticed that I was less vocal about being gay. Partly, most people who knew me on my team knew, but I wasn't an activist around it the way anyone I was around race. Some of it was about my relationships with the black community in the council, and particularly the prevalence of strong people with strong Christian beliefs and strong, a few with strong Muslim beliefs. So I was reticent in the staff group to be out. But the other thing that influenced that was the fact that we had a gay leader and two deputy leaders for the council, all of whom were gay. So in terms of fighting something, it didn't seem unnecessary. So there was something around that. And then when I was at Black Thrive, I felt it was necessary to be open and out. I think the organisation was almost entirely black. We had about 30 staff who had one white, two Asian people. So, and it was important, I felt, to be out because blackness was the norm for the organisation. They were fighting around and advocating for equality. Obviously, that was our main thing. But it was important to include LGBTQ plus people in the blackness, because there's a tendency in black communities not to. And it caused a lot of strength and angst in all sorts of ways. But what happened in the end is that as the organisation grew, about 30–40% of our staff were LGBTQ plus. We had about 4 people who identify as trans, which is very unusual because it was probably the only home as a workplace that they could see in able to be black out. And so that's partly why it was important, because the consequence of not being open is significant. That's, those are my thoughts on that.
Go ahead.
Well, because for 30 years run my own consultancy and training company, it was relatively easy for me to be out as a lesbian. And I hope that what we created was an environment in the company where we talked about institutionalized racism, we talked about discrimination and privilege and advantage and disadvantage and all of that amongst ourselves, but also with clients every day. That doesn't mean that we got it right, we definitely didn't. My learning curve is like this. When I'm doing consultancy work, they can see that I'm a white woman. People can see that, and that is obviously nearly always, means that I am treated differently and am privileged. I very rarely talk about what I've talked said to you all this evening, you know, where I'm from and when I was born and coming out north, because actually it's about the people in the room. It's around moving those people and that organisation, metaphorically taking them by the hand, as it were, and getting them to think about this. If you are a leader, tell me precisely how you take account of difference in the way that you performance manage. Tell me precisely, not waffly. Tell me precisely what you do day in, day out to run a meeting which is inclusive to introverts and extroverts and people at the most junior points in an organisation, the beginning as well as others, and making sure that different voices are heard. So we get so in many contexts in my life, it's actually not for me to stand on and say this is who I am, because in and of itself, I don't think it's very interesting. What my job is to do is to help that organisation. Remember, they might have been on the front page of all of the newspapers and they might have had a bust up and there's all kinds of things going on. My job is to think about how they can build on good practice and address the things that need to be addressed. So I think it's different for all of us around which aspects of our identity we bring into a workplace. And that I'm sure we're all thoughtful about that.
So I wanted to ask Ben, because this is an area of your research, I think, but there's a mantra, oh, thank you, that's okay, there's a mantra that's quite common in leadership these days about facilitating, allowing people to bring their whole selves to work. But it seems to me that it's more complicated than that. It might not be always important or not important. I wondered what your thoughts were on that or on anything that they or Jane had said.
The challenge is trying to organize those thoughts, because I think we could talk about this for so long. What's really struck me listening to both of your experiences is how much things change from context to context. And I think the research does support that idea, because role models, for example, are so important. So if you're in an organization and you see people from a certain group and they're open and they're being their authentic selves, it obviously encourages people who are also part of that group that they can also be open and authentic. But I think it actually rubs off onto other groups and other people as well. And that's something that hasn't been studied quite so much in the academic literature that I'm really interested in. So for example, if we create this environment where people can be open and authentic, you have the CEO who is out to the organization. Do people then feel that they can tell their boss that they're pregnant and discuss maternity and paternity leave? People come to work and say, oh, actually, I'm neurodivergent and there's things going on here. And I think that that's true, because people who have stigmatized identities, so an identity that isn't valued necessarily in society, we are constantly surveilling our environments and organizations to figure out whether we can be safe in those places. And so role models, policies that the organizations have, those things are all really important. So it'll play out differently for each individual, but I think ultimately the concept of being authentic can still apply across those different identities.
I guess it's about, yeah, I mean, we don't all always say everything about ourselves to everybody that we meet. So you can be authentic without having to be completely revealing.
Yeah, and I think, and I think that thinking about Jane's point, there is something about the work that you tend to do, and when it's helpful and when it's unhelpful. And I think sometimes it's helpful to disclose, and sometimes it's not helpful. But there's also something about the consequences for you as a person. So in some organisations, as benefit, it's unsafe. So people don't want to say, and it's because it's unsafe. But there are some identities you can't conceal, and therefore, if it's unsafe as a black person, a disabled person, then that's just what you've got a choice. So there's always a hierarchy of identity that and consequences. But for me, I sometimes, slightly different from what Jane said, I sometimes disclose in a work context in order to shape things up a bit. I.e., everyone's sitting there thinking, oh yes, we're all the same, we're all agree, and so on. Then you lob something in, and then they're forced to think. Now, it could backfire, but I think that it's so the whole. I remember we had a big row at one of our working groups at Class Thrive, where somebody, the chair of the working group, made a few homophobic comments. And so I had him and myself, me, him and somebody else, another staff member, I had a chat after. And he was going on and on and on about how he's said this, he says, oh, it's wrong, it's wrong, blah, blah, and on we went. And then I said, well, I'm gay. And he goes, oh, no. And so it was a big deal for him, but he did not change his, because he'd always been a Nigerian guy, he'd always been very respectful, looked after him and so on. And actually, ultimately, he didn't change the way he treated me. So I was so, he allowed me to be okay with others, but hopefully, it made him consider his position. But we had a huge round of debate in the organisation. It's like, how do we position ourselves? Do we get rid of him and tell him to leave because of his views? Or do we just say, well, this is the reality of working with some communities and we can't expel everybody? That's not inclusive either. I won't even be able to talk about the whole, I've spent the whole day about the way in which that whole discussion ends.
Go ahead, yeah.
So, very interesting, thank you so much. For me, the conversation rotates a lot around who is a leader, what is leadership, and how one becomes a leader. So it's such a multi-dimensional conversation. It's also my area of expertise there that I study. So there is a conversation about leadership emergence. So who becomes a leader? And this conversation is very entangled in stereotypes, prototypes. Who do we think is a leader? And you always have people that emerge. How do people that do not match this prototype that we have leaders? So just to give you an example, the average height of the American president is always much taller than the average American man every year. There are studies that show you that children that are 4-year-old can predict election results just by seeing the face of the person. So we are talking about question bias. When you look at legislative emergence, it's like crazy stuff. So how do we emerge as leaders when we do not match the prototype, which on this side of the room, we are not really prototypical, right? It depends from context to context, but let's talk about the main group prototype. But the beautiful thing is that, people emerge for several reasons. We've heard incredible life stories, and I think we all have life stories that make us emerge as people and then we succeed. But the beautiful thing is that there is massive hope that when people emerge as leaders, they can change the prototype. And I think this is exactly what you're talking about in terms of I've seen a lot of change. Because we are seeing more leaders that are not prototypical, the old school prototype that we all can imagine. So the question perhaps of the conversation could be a little bit more about if we, in your experiences, do we have practices or ideas about this leader emerge or how you emerged? I mean, that's possibly an interesting question to think about genderize and racialize differences.
I should have said this at the beginning. You will all have thoughts and ideas, and there will be a time at the end for a general conversation for sure. So please hold those thoughts and ideas. Something that a couple of you said has got me thinking around this idea of lived experience. And there is a narrative now about the importance of lived experience. So And in some instances, the narrative is somebody without lived experiences of an identity shouldn't be speaking about it. If you're as a leader, that's complicated because none of us will have lived experience of everything, and yet we will have responsibility for things which will impact people with other lived experiences. How do you navigate that, or what's your view? Jane, you look like you've got.
Well, I do have thoughts. So it is very complicated, and of course there are some contexts in where lived experience is really critical and valuable and all of those things. But sometimes I feel as though there's a bit of what are you thinking of it? Because just because I am whatever doesn't mean I'm great at sorting it. It doesn't necessarily mean, as a woman, it doesn't mean that I'm great at tackling institutionalised sexism. It doesn't go together. So I think we just have to be very precise about when and how lived experience adds value. And it can cloud me, for example, or any of us. It can actually sometimes get in the way. I can't see somebody else's perspective. And I think so. That's what concerns me. Actually, it's a little bit. And you were talking about being ourselves at work. Well, I worry about that as well, because in some ways I think that's a fantastic thing to be ourselves at work. But what if I'm a bully? Not so good. What if I'm naturally moody? And what am I if I'm absolutely convinced that my religion is the only religion that matters? So I think again we have to be really careful. It's not okay. Let's take the moody example. Hard to believe, I'm sure, but I could be. But it's not okay, is it? If I just say to you, my team, I'm really, this is just the way I am. Actually, I'm really moody, and you won't know whether I'm going to come in storming and banging things down, or whether I'm going to be utterly charming. It's not okay. So I think that's what I think. Really, we've got to be really precise and careful.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I was in I agree about lived experience, and I think it's become something that everybody bandies around, and often, or it can be a bit meaningless, because sometimes as well it can be quite patronising. People are put in a position where they are assumed to have no other skill other than their lived experience, and so they're not seen. So the rest of the podcast offers the same. And going back to Zahira's question around gendered and racialized leadership, I don't know, I was watching from the other day, I don't know her, but she's got this book called The Authority Gap. And it shows that women, even now, today, yes, things might have improved, but women don't get given authority when they are, their authority is challenged, and
They don't take it.
they don't take it. And black women are something like 4 or 5 times or less likely. The situation is much worse if you're black and female. So, and they talk about the way in which we internalize these notions of leadership. So even if we are from the community and have the lived experience can mean that we actually have doubts in ourselves. So I think there's clear evidence of what Zahira was saying around who's a leader. And still in the NHS, still in the central and local government, still in academia, I mean, you're more likely to bump into a terrorist on the high road and to come across a black professor. And so there are certain websites, well, what's going on here? But I think that there's some of the terminology around things like skills. So the NHS, certainly in London, the shortage staff are colour, but the leadership is almost entirely white. And it was Roger Pine coined the phrase "snowy white peaks of the NHS," and it showed that actually they've gone backwards since 1980. So this thing about who is seen to be a leader, but the thing from the snowy white peaks, or others talk about pints of Guinness, I think the thing that's scary is the way that it goes backwards. It's almost a bit as if we've got some kind of hardwiring, cultural, maybe not hard, cultural wiring, that means that when things get tough or whatever, we revert. And that's apparently quite a lot of research says that happens.
Thank you for saying that. And I wanted to reply something because I'm the director of the MBA at the school, which is the program that trains managers to move on to higher position of leadership. And half of my role in the classroom when I teach them, but also as the director of the MBA, is to create a place that really empowers this minority to understand that they are leaders, that they can be leaders. And, I'm a half Palestinian, half Italian woman. I would normally say Arabic, but I've decided I need to say I'm half Palestinian. And for so many years I've hidden this identity. And I feel just being there, right? Just being there and being in that position to empower people and tell them, it doesn't matter who you are, you can do it. You've got the skills. And the lived experience becomes then a good platform for them to think about who they are and for them to become proud of who they are and to become aware of who they are. I think the key word here is awareness with the experience. That's very interesting. Something then?
Sure. So one thing that came to mind, I teach negotiations at Sussex, and oftentimes I think women are blamed for the fact that there's a gender pay gap and the fact that we don't have more women leaders, because we say, well, why aren't women negotiating more? Why aren't they putting themselves forward for these things? But actually the research on that shows that when women do negotiate, they're punished for it relative to men. But interestingly, it's not just men who punish women who ask for more, it's other women as well. So I think a lot of times when we engage in these discussions about inclusion, at least when I'm teaching it, the message I try not to lead with is all white men are bad, or if you have dominant majority identities that you're bad. Try to get people to think about their identities, because even if you're not part of any stigmatized group, you still have multiple identities, and that means something. And there's all this really fascinating research on what is whiteness, for example, and people who identify as being more white than others or more male than others. It's really fascinating psychology there. But yeah, I think the research definitely does not support this idea that we should be blaming women and minorities for these things, because actually there are very good reasons why people don't put themselves forward more.
It feels to me that the issue of lived experience it's like a lot of things, and I think this is an issue to do with EDI work. To some extent, most people are scared of EDI work, and I think that people are scared of being thought of as being bad. It's to your point, Ben, about and it sounds to me great that you remind people that not all white men are bad or whatever, because I think that there is almost we kind of lean into a narrative that if you're marginalized or multiply marginalized, that equates to good person, and if you are a white male heterosexual middle class pecunious procreating man from Kent with 2 kids and a Labrador, it's devil incarnate sort of thing. And maybe I shouldn't give this example, but you could be that one could be that person and had been horribly abused all their childhood, sort of thing. So these, it isn't, to my mind, it isn't to then ignore identity, because structurally, as everybody has said, we know, the point you made, Zahira, and Ben, well, all of us really, about the structural nature of exclusion are real issues, but it then gets collapsed into kind of almost tricksy, neat. If it's that way, it's okay. If it's that way, it's not okay. And I used to run Equality Challenge Unit, which was the UK HE sector's EDI policy and research agency. And I'd say the fact that we're run by a disabled person does not mean that we get everything right around it's your point as well. And the fact that we're run by a man doesn't mean we get everything wrong around ending sexism or male domination. So I find this really interesting, but I think that we're on a journey. I mean, I don't just mean Sussex, I mean we as communities.
I think that's right, and we have to keep our eye, don't we, on the systemic and institutionalised ways in which power and privilege play out in organisational settings. So a better, clearer way of saying that is who gets what, which group gets. How is it that compound discrimination plays out? So a working class black woman will have a different experience from a working class white, and so on. So when we're thinking about inclusive leadership, so it's got to be right, hasn't it? It's like, how is it that we're getting leaders to think about and understand what you've said about recognise and etc. Models of leadership and play their part, whoever they are, whether they are parent or whoever, play their part in dismantling the ways, the structural ways, and systemic ways in which, let's say, I'm going to give a straightforward example. I'm on a panel, a 23-year-old walks in, and I think, I don't think so. I mean, I'm for a job. I don't think so. It's a really big job. So it says more about me than it does about the candidate. They haven't even sat down yet. And it's something around in day-to-day works in leadership positions. Leaders can partly confront and change the way all of those things play out. If they are aware and if they are willing to engage in dismantling how power and privilege plays out. Some of them are not, of course. They're very, very happy with the status quo. It's another conversation.
So Hira, you wanted to talk about racialized or gendered leadership.
Yeah, it's a very point that Jenny is bringing up, because I said earlier that sometimes when leaders were not prototypical, it's very different from the group prevalent idea of the leader. When they become leaders, then they can change a prototype. But often what happens, and this is so heartbreaking, they become leader and they reinforce the prototype, right? So I give you two examples. Women prime ministers. Right, so the majority of prime ministers are men. Margaret Thatcher, she reinforced the masculine prototype. Jacinda Ardern, she managed to break the prototype. She even brought her baby in Parliament as a prime minister. That was pretty cool. In doing that, she also brought her husband, who actually looked after the baby when she was in Parliament, which also broke another prototype. So the point is that, and we see it very often, for minority groups that do not fit the prototype, it's so difficult to emerge that often when they emerge, they actually reinforce very conservative ideas of what it means to be a leader. So unsurprisingly, it's much more easy for non-prototypical leaders to emerge if they belong to conservative parties. Giorgia Meloni in Italy is a right-wing leader. Rishi Sunak, the first, Indian origin leader we have in the country, belongs to the Conservative Party. We are seeing some, Suella Braverman adopting very conservative policy for someone who actually is the daughter of immigrants. So it's quite interesting. This is a quite recurrent phenomenon. So it's very difficult to become a leader under pressure and be yourself. Understandably, but it's great when it happens because it really changes how things are done. And yeah, so this is what I think.
So can I just ask you? So is it that you're saying? I mean, I think you're right, but are you saying, Zahira, that if you have an obviously underrepresented or marginalized identity, maybe the fastest way to become a leader is to become as conservative as possible?
Well, to emulate the prototype as much as possible.
Emulate the prototype, okay.
Yes, this is what you want to do.
Sure, thank you. Lela, yeah.
That's interesting. I was actually wondering about another theory for what's happening, particularly with the Tory party in this country. And I wonder whether it's the case that actually, when push comes to shove, socialism trumps other things. And what I mean by that is that I look at the Rishi Sunak, Lela, quasi-quartain, BT Patel, etc. And I think, gosh, I don't think the Labour Party would ever have such an ethnically diverse team. And then I think, and this partly leads to the point I was, when we were talking privately earlier about public sector versus the private sector, that there are times when actually capital issues, all these people, it's not about their background, but what they aspire to is more, that capital aspiration is more important than the colour of your skin. Today, it hasn't always been the case. And I always used to think the real race is when, in spite of the fact that you know that you will win if you have a black pairing or football team or a black sprinter, you not. That for me is like, oh my God, that's serious. Because I think we've moved in a way past that. So if it is an advantage or helpful, it is certainly helpful for Tories that have all these black and brown people telling the rest of us that, you know, we need to block on, and that's the issue, that, you know, to say that we should start the border, you know, not let these refugees and immigrants come in. It is much easier for that to come from a person of colour. And I'm not sure that any whiteness ever goes as far as to a Roman tell on immigration, for example. But I think that, I don't think they're pretending. Or,
No,
do you know what I mean? I think that that's how, those are their beliefs. But because those are their beliefs, they are likely to rise in the Tory party. And the Tory party are finding that I can use so. And similarly, what I've noticed is that in terms of organisation policies, once a private art activist organisation decides that, oh, actually, yeah, why don't we have the best person work with others? They just get on with it and deliver it. The public sector are very positive, well-meaning, all kinds of platitudes. And a friend of mine who runs an organisation, Very Recruitment, which focuses on recruiting people from colour to economies, he said in the end to how public sector, because the Shell, the Barclays, and so on, banks were like, go and get them now they're in the first year, and recruit them for me, I'll have them when they finish. And there was no ifs or buts, you get them with the sector running around in circles after many years. You know what I mean? So there's something about that kind of like, these people will do good promises without them. You know.
Yeah, that's absolutely spot on. And when I started my consultative training company, we worked in the public sector because that's what we knew. I'd never worked in the private sector. And then over the years, more and more, it became just harder and harder. Now that's partly because the public sector has been battered so much, of course, and starved of resources, and that's clear. I think it's absolutely right. At some point, and I would say it was about 8 or 10 years ago, but you probably know better than I around these kind of shifts, but it's something around exactly right. This company wants the best people they can get their hands on from across the globe. Now they're going to think about diversity and inclusion because they see it as a tool of competitive advantage. They're going to want to recruit the best people from across the world. They're going to retain, so therefore the management and leadership has to be right. It can't be, got to do something about this hostile environment where so-called banter happens. Where, so it might be that black people come, and if it's such a hostile environment that it's a revolving door and out they go, well, that costs money. So there's something around, again, I'm not I'm not naive, but I do as much work in the private sector, if not more, than the public sector. I like working in both, and I like working in the third sector. They haven't got any money, of course, so that's another matter. But there's something, I think it's absolutely right, that there's a hard edge now. I'm working with an F1 team at the moment, and they some savings F1, and they correlate their work on diversity and equity with a tenth of a second faster. Nobody can tell me that was happening 10 years ago. That connection between performance and diversity and inclusion. I'm not naive. It is, of course, I thought Labour's right. It's not. I've never been ashamed or diffident about talking about the business case. Because otherwise, if you don't, a recession comes along and all things to do with EDI are swept away. And we've seen that decade upon decade. Make the business case, weave it into the business strategy, and then it becomes a bit more difficult to rubbish it the next time things get tricky. Because, of course, there will be a moment quite soon, again and again and again, there always is, where things will be contested and difficult, and haven't we all gone a bit too far? And isn't it all a bit woke?
So I want to bring in Ben in a second, because I want to come on to another theme that we want us to talk about, which is EDI initiatives. But I want to say a provocation. And I hope that everybody's drunk so much that they won't remember that one. But I should say at the outset, this is purely for the purposes of this discussion. But I want to think about organisations that have value propositions. So Sussex, we as a university, we would say that we're values driven. So we have in our strategy, we have 5 core values. And I personally think they're great: kindness, integrity, courage, I never remember what
Inclusion, collaboration.
Collaboration, thank you. Inclusion is one of our strategic pillars. And we talk about these in various ways. We don't call them appraisals now, we call them ADRs, but effectively the appraisals, they come up. And I think they're great, but I sometimes wonder whether they can become sclerotic, or whether we can fall over them. We can become overly concerned with things like that. Whereas, to oversimplify the points that you're making, if you're running a motor racing team, success is shaving off a tenth of a second off the time, and that's what you do. And if diversity gets you there, you're not going to worry about kindness. You're just going to go for it. Now, I'm accentuating for effect. This is not my view, but is there an argument that we can get too stuck on EDI initiatives?
No.
Well, there's one answer. Please hold your thoughts. Well, don't hold your thoughts, say your thoughts, but we are definitely going to have this conversation.
Yeah, so we had a speaker last week, Professor Lela from Purdue. She was talking about flexible work across different time periods, but especially post-pandemic, post-COVID-19. And one of the things she was talking about is the adoption of flexible work policies as an EDI initiative, and how in many cases it backfires in organizations. And actually the people who use these flexible working policies are no happier with their organization than people who don't use the policy. And there was all kinds of research around people being punished actually for taking up those policies. So I think that, to answer your question, it depends on what the focus is around the EDI initiative. Are the focuses that we just come up with all these policies, or are we focused on really understanding the implications of them and really making sure that they're followed, and what happens when they're not followed? And I think those are really interesting questions. So I think you can obsess about these things, focus your energy in the wrong places, and it's about figuring out the right places. Because what I learned from her talk was that there's so many ways that these policies can fail. So even if you have a policy and it's incorporated into your HR strategy, even if the senior leaders are on board, even if you have supportive middle managers, you can still have employees who are scared to
Yeah.
to undergo, to take advantage of the policy. Or you have the employees who desperately want to, but then the one middle manager who's the weak link in the chain. So it really struck me just how much can go wrong and how much needs to go perfectly in order for these things to work the way we intend them to.
Right. I mean, just to be clear, as it happens, I take a very strong structural view of exclusion, and I absolutely think EDI initiatives are essential to unpick the structures. But I'm curious about where people get stuck. Maybe that's what it is.
So I'm really interested, for example, when I was in investment banking, my boss wanted to become managing director. And in order to become managing director, you had to hire, you had to have women in your team. But they came to hire me. I was 27, very naive. And this big guy comes and said, hey, if you'd like to have you in your team, I'm like, really? Yeah. It's great. And so I got to this, he was a very tough guy, made a huge amount of money. It wasn't the trading floor, so it was actually, on the very, very competitive part of the business. Anyway, he was promoted to managing director and he didn't need me anymore, and he certainly disposed of me in the next 2 years. It was not very nice at all. And of course, he hired people who were men and belonged to the same nationality he was, so he went back to. So it's very, very difficult to have policies that work because you have people that manipulate them. Nevertheless, even if I've had these very, very bad experiences in my own personal working life, I think they're very important. And I think we should always, it's like iron, we have always to hammer the iron. Always, 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 never, ever, ever, ever give up on this. It's really a long-term project. And, my mom was a feminist, trade unionist, and I am very, very aware of who married the Palestinian woman, by the way, there was trade union. So I'm very aware about how much we are already seeking on the shoulders of giants, and we have to keep on. It's a long-term project. So yes, we need them all the time.
Absolutely. When people say, does it do an EDI programs work, it's a little bit like, I think, does unconscious bias training work? Well, as we're all saying, it depends. Because of course it can be done with water and done in a really cynical way, and everybody goes along with it and says, well, that's all, it didn't change anything. So EDI doesn't really do anything. But you're right, Sahiri, it has to be right. It's a long-term project, and we have to be as strategic and creative and innovative about what will affect change and how do we equip inclusive leaders to be able to affect change, and how do we make sure that it's exciting. I feel as though I've spent my professional life doing the most exciting work that there is to be done in the world. I feel like, how lucky am I? It hasn't been easy. It's sometimes really grim. And actually, every organisation, including this one, comes up against really, really difficult, contested issues. And it's a test for us all about how we find a way through that. Every single organisation, private, public, or third sector, and I think the test is, well, how do we learn from it? What can we do differently? And how do we engage with nuance and complexity? And I think that's really tough for us all.
Lela.
Yes, I think it's really interesting, and I think that going back to something you said earlier, Jane, about the business results, whether it's Formula One or whatever, I think in the end that's where success lies. Believing that it's actually a business result as opposed to a personal result for your line manager guy who just wanted his position. And if he values you genuinely because knowing that your perspective would add value to the business. Now, some people, because of the huge prejudice they have, don't actually believe that. And one of the things that I tried to develop a course, which I ran a few times but didn't do it really when I was at Islington, was for picking up the notion I learned from a friend of mine about multicultural competence in leadership, and tried to run a course for the people of colour in the organisation to persuade and convince that it's because of their difference that they are going to be better leaders, not in spite of. And it's because of your difference. And I think that when people start believing that, then you get somewhere. So, and you don't need, so the EDI policies are helpful for the people, the few that might, do the wrong thing. But in fact, that they're building a culture where people think, because of your difference, you are a value.
Yeah.
And so, and part of where I started from was part of going to talk about their backgrounds, but then letting them see that the problems that the local authority is trying to solve are problems that are respectable, which most of the leaders do not. And the same thing in the NHS. What shocked me when I worked with the NHS was the fact that they're constantly looking for people with experience to drive from wherever they may be, but having no other expectation of accountability within the organisation. There were people who, but they never listened to them. And I remember talking to a Middle Eastern woman who said, well, I think this is the reason for this, that, and the other. We get regarding the services. And I was like, well, why don't you say so? They never listen to me. So that thing about, because you are from this community, the thing that the NHS or local authorities grappling with is the thing that you can help them solve. And that, I think, I do believe that's true. So it's not just like, and if people don't believe that, then I think EDI policies don't work. We should just drag people from here and there, put them on, colour in at the top, put a couple of disabled people here, and then you think, but you never believed that it was going to have value. And I think that's where
I think that's absolutely right. And you reminded me of my favourite piece of work in the last few years, which was about 4 days with a senior leadership team when they were writing their new business strategy. And my job was solely to help them weave EDI into procurement and every single aspect of the organisation. Because the chief exec was brilliant and got it, I was there to provoke and to ask questions and say, how can we weave standards around cultural competence into the leadership framework? How can we think about it in relation to health and safety procurement, indeed every single aspect of this organisation, including monitoring, of course, the differential services that you are providing, depending on people's age, race, sex, and all of that. That was a fantastic. I mean, they're all really fed up at the end of 4 days. But they also thought, actually, the business strategy is different. So that's when it's interesting. It's like weaving it in, not saying, right, now we're going to have a little bit of an EDI moment over here.
That's so annoying, that bit. Okay, we've been talking quite a lot, and I would like to give anyone really an opportunity to ask something or say something. I think we need to hand round the microphone. Is that right? And let's just see how it goes. But I'm going to suggest we take 2 comments or questions, and then just see how we go. So there was one person there, yeah.
My name's Jackie O'Reilly. I'm a professor of HR in the business school, and I'm a director of the Sussex Research Centre on digital future work. I suspect I'm representing a minority here. I know professors aren't the only leaders in organisations like universities. How many professors are actually here? 1, 2. Congratulations. I think that illustrates one of the problems this organisation actually faces. I've sat in meetings where in terms of English type, people are not embarrassed to write in the chat and put their hand up and say, what is EDI? Oh my God, it's absolutely shocking. There are so many professors in this university who don't even know what those three letters mean. Despite us being extremely active in business school, I think that's number one challenge for the team that are even more leaders than us. But the other question I wanted to ask is one I've been grappling with trying to understand how to manage. Now, there is professional service staff who work in various aspects, for example, the research office, often tell me that a lot of professors come in, they're really arrogant, demeaning, treat them like rubbish, and they kind of put up with it. And there is a culture where professional staff, service staff have that thing. They articulate it in particular ways, but it's like, oh well, that's just the way they are, whether they're moody, grumpy, whatever. I think that is a real problem, and one we really need to address. And the question I have for the panel is, how do we do that? So I'll give an example of something I don't quite know how to manage. For example, if I'm in a meeting with a mixture of different professors from other universities and some of our professional service staff, I've seen them speak really rudely and dismissively to professional service staff in a grumpy way. And I find that really difficult to know, what do I say? I mean, sometimes I've actually said at the end of the meeting, I've apologised when that person's left, so I'm really sorry it spoke to you like that. But I shouldn't deal with it at the time. It's very, very challenging, because do I come across like a school teacher and say, David, you shouldn't speak. I thought you didn't mean to be quite so arrogant and rude in that comment you just made. I don't know what to do. So the question to the panel is, real practical advice. What do you do in a meeting when somebody more senior in terms of the hierarchy of occupations treats somebody who doesn't earn as much money in a rude way? What do you do then?
That's a great question. I mean, I have a thought. Jane?
It is a great question. So there's something, isn't it, about what are the standards of chairing a meeting here and everywhere. So if you're got the privilege of chairing a meeting, then there presumably could be a set of standards which mean that I have to pre-meeting think about what I need to circulate so that people can understand what the meeting's about, that I keep to time, because that's an equalities issue, that I say at the beginning of the meeting. It is absolutely critical in this meeting that we hear different voices from different parts of the university or whatever it is, and I'm going to sometimes have to cut a few of you off so that we make sure that we hear different voices. And so the chair is in such a powerful position, if they know what they're doing, to create an environment which is encouraging, firm and encouraging. And it's one of the, I love doing work on that, because it's like, what does an organisation think they have to do pre, during and after a meeting to make it more inclusive, and actually it is up to the chair more than anyone to say, if, let's say, it's David getting out of hand again, that if David is being patronising to this member of professional services, that I say, David, actually, I'd like to stop you there, and I'd like to get a conversation with you at the end of the meeting about this discussion. Now, I know it's difficult if he's my boss, and I know none of it's easy, but there's something about how do we learn to challenge in the moment, rather than someone saying to somebody at the end of a meeting, oh, I think it was terrible what he said, didn't it? I mean, I thought it was dreadful. No, how do we get better? We have to teach people how to challenge in real time and create a culture where what you're describing is not acceptable. And actually, if somebody continued to do that, what are the consequences? So it probably doesn't answer your question completely, but they're my first thoughts.
Anybody want to add anything, or we'll move on to a... Okay. Oh, sorry, Ben. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I really love Jackie's question, and I think also what Jane has said. And I think a lot of it boils down to whether workplace incivility is actually taken seriously. So, for example, not even just at the professor level, you know, we can have an organization that has all kinds of values, but when people apply for discretionary pay reviews or for promotions, is people behavior actually considered when we do those things? And when we have our, yearly reviews, is that behavior considered? I think, at least in the business school, people who have leadership positions as head of department or associate deans get feedback, 360-degree feedback from people at various places in the school. But for people who aren't in those positions, that's not part of the process. So somebody could just routinely behave that way and no one would really know. And if it ever did get brought up, I don't think people would really care. So I think separate from challenging those things in the moment, I think there has to be a way to hold people accountable for workplace incivility through actual processes like pay and promotions and those kind of things.
I mean, I just say one thing, which is that I think we all need to try and call things out as they happen. Personally, that's my view. Okay, then let's take a couple over here. There are two people, one in front of each other.
Hi, I'm Sophie Valles. I also work at the business school. One of my disciplines is that I get really, really stressed when I'm speaking in public, so stay with me and phone. You talked about representation and the positive angle of having diverse and inclusive workplaces and leaders. And so looking at really focusing on that positivity that it provides and that it allows people, workplaces to be better. But if we set aside the human rights and dignity aspect, it's obvious to everybody here, we need to work on EDI. Is it actually proven that it's better to have diverse organizations and leaders? Have we shown that? Can we show that in research at all? Or are we still fighting to show that it's true?
So, okay. There are three ways when we do it. Yeah, the legal way, the social justice way, and the business way. Now, the business way is, even now, Robin Lela, who basically is the inventor of the business case at Harvard Business School, is the academic that has invented the concept and trying to pursue it. She has issued an update to her business case article in 1996 last year. And she said, 20 years later, or whatever number of years it is, we can still not say that diversity is always conducive to good business. But it's also a bit of a funny question because we need to understand context, right? I mean, what works in every context? I mean, seriously, and what kind of level of diversity are we talking about? Now, if you're grabbing a couple of people that don't know each other and they all come from different cultures and you dump them together to work together, they're going to have quite strong intercultural conflict in trying to understand even what they're talking about, right? So clearly that kind of diversity is counterproductive. But if you are actually thinking that the diversity can match the issues of your context, so you are a company that has clients from X, Y, Z background, it makes sense to have salespeople from Y, Z background. I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer, right? So it's really important to be very nuanced and very clever, and certainly you can speak about it better than me because you've been trying to do it, in your own, but yes. So it's very difficult to say, yes, diversity will always make you more money. It just doesn't work like that.
And I like what you said before here about imitating the dominant identity, culture, leadership type. So that actually, it may not work if when a black or brown person or a woman or a disabled person gets into a position and their aim is to ensure that they don't stick out. And therefore, they go with the flow. And so that, I think, is also one of the ways in which diversity doesn't necessarily lead to better business. So I guess, I think it can and should, if pointed in the right way and done for the right reasons, and is intelligent. the number of British companies now who realise that you can't turn up in the USA with an all-white male team, and they don't think it's okay. Problems the USA may have, don't deny it, but most companies now in the USA are shocked when British companies turn up with an all-white male team. They are horrified because it just isn't considered unacceptable. So from that kind of point of view, you need to start thinking about actually you're not going to be in contracts, etc. So there's that kind of business advantage. But for me, there's a deeper level of the right, it's a bit like the right to the right talk, the right people, the right. There's no point in appointing people just because of trying to get diversity, as they were saying. It's actually, this type of diversity is helpful because it relates to the nature of the work we're trying to do. That's what I think.
I agree. There's something, isn't there, about with any EDI intervention, right at the beginning, we have to work out what the success criteria are. Why are we doing it? How will we measure success here? And not over the next 3 months. Over the next 3 months, maybe. Everyone had a lovely discussion, hopefully. But it's not serious, is it? It's over the next 1, 2, 3, 5, and with some of my clients, 10 years. So I think it's right that there is some good research now. And the first question in some settings that I work in is, well, what precisely will be the return on investment? So just put that to one side for a moment, and then because actually it's an impossible question to answer until every organisation has worked out why they're doing it, what the success criteria are, and then a detailed plan about how to operationalise it. And the operationalising is very basic very often. Are people being line managed? Are, as David says, people encouraged and supported to speak up when they hear something wrong? Can people have disagreements without like high drama? I think drama is quite interesting, isn't it? Because there's a lot of drama around EDI, loads of drama going on. And one of the things that I think we need to do is take the temperature down and think our way through. Because while we're all up here being very dramatic, I understand it, right? Because we very often can be very upset and angry. So I'm not denying the importance of that emotional response. But at some point, quickly, we need to get the temperature down and think about what will create lasting change around the status quo.
Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
Really quickly, some pieces of research that I find super fascinating on this topic. So there was some work showing that organizations that became more diverse had more conflict. And sort of the take on that piece was basically that diversity is bad. But actually, the interesting thing is that conflict itself is not necessarily bad within organizations. It depends on what type of conflict it is. So if you have more conflict that's interpersonal, because you have different people interacting with each other, that can have a negative impact on the performance of teams and organizations. And so I think that's where EDI interventions need to focus. Exactly, I think what Jane is saying. But interestingly, when you also have diverse people working together, you can have more conflict over the task itself. So think of like brainstorming different ideas, and people will have different ideas about how to accomplish the task and what to do. But that actually leads to more creativity and innovation and better performance. So it's a little bit more of a nuanced thing. So not all conflict is bad.
Yeah, I could talk about this for hours. I'm not going to, but I'm just going to say two things. I think there is a no-brainer argument, which is, if you're looking for a creative solutions, do you want heterogeneity or do you want homogeneity? And there's only one answer to that, really. But there is a lot of nuance, as I think everybody has said. The other point I would make is that arguments against diversity, even on business case arguments, but it doesn't really show very much, presumes that what you have hitherto is somehow natural sort of thing. So it presumes, for example, that the reason why 25% of members of the cabinet all went to one school is because that's somehow naturally inevitable. And the issue about that is that is as constructed as any diversity initiative. So it does need to be deconstructed. All of this needs to be deconstructed with the nuance that's been talked about. Okay, you had a point or a question.
I've tried to form a question at the end of my point.
Okay.
Probably it's just a point. Some kinds of racism is not very overt or aggressive. I'd like to call it benevolent racism if possible. It's like it has happened quite a few times that as a woman of color, no one is going to approach you, even if they're your colleagues, no one is going to start a conversation with you. Because they're scared, probably of saying something wrong, but because no one approaches you, A, you're excluded, and B, the onus of integration is always on you, always, and it's very draining. To the extent that some of my colleagues who are of color have just started avoiding work parties and all because they're like, why should we do it all the time? Now, the thing is, at the personal level, how do you maneuver such situations? And as a leader, what kind of intervention? So how can we kind of bridge the gap? Because it's just very draining to, and also it brings a whole career question. How are you going to network if you're go to these events, but you're the only one there who's trying to integrate themselves?
Any thoughts on that?
I think you're right. I don't know if I can offer much that's very useful, other than one of the positions that I, a personal experience really, I've taken is to not always give up, but just see how I feel. So as a woman, black woman accountant, I used to walk into the kind of accounting rooms and it's all white with an edged bloke. And I think I can't look. And I didn't for a while. And then after a while, I thought, you know what? The next time that somebody goes, I want to be there. So I would force myself to tolerate the horror and go along so that when, and it works to some extent. Because otherwise, what happens if one person goes at a time there, nobody ever, there's never a group. So that's one possible response. But in terms of what does leadership do, it's that what you're describing is actually quite simple. So most people wouldn't notice that that is what is actually going on. They don't notice the cost of inclusion, but those of us who don't belong to the majority culture. And I think there's something perhaps as a leader of noticing and trying to find out from the people affected what might work for them, and understanding it. And there's also something about relationship. One of the things I've learned in my life, and I first met David quite a long time ago, we developed a relationship around conflict, actually. And it was a conflict that was relating to blackness and Jewishness. And we had a row, and then we entered into, through that row, we entered into a relationship, but we had more thoughts in common than difference. But when I say the thing about relationship in this context is that the relationship thing actually, at an individual level, actually changes the way in which you feel about being in or out. I don't know if that kind of explains it, because you enter into a relationship which kind of transcends but doesn't run away from the conflict. It's not always easy, and I think most people that were in our position those years ago in Los Angeles, as it turned out, would have probably never spoken to each other again, because we were really not in agreement about what was actually going on. But in the end, there's a relationship, there's a trust, and so on. And that way. I don't know if that's useful or not, but anybody else have any thoughts?
So my thought is around how the people who are oblivious to what you've just described can be helped to understand what being the only one means, or one of a few, because many people have never had that experience. You know, if 3 black men were interviewing me, I would notice. So it's something about how do we, doesn't mean they can't do a great job, but I would notice. So it's how do we build the competence of people to understand what being in a minoritized group means, right? So there's something there, which if we get it right around helping people to understand, and then creating a culture which expects people to be able to work across identities, including, I think that example is great, including people who we really, really, really don't agree with. And that's a competence, isn't it? It's a leadership competence, and it's not easy. I think it's a great question, and that point around people being tired because they're having to mask or having to do the work. It's on some people's shoulders a lot more than others, and other people are skipping along, not even noticing. So the question is, what do we do about it? How do we build a competence in organisations to mean that you are not experiencing that? Yeah.
I have to say, I think that's a leadership responsibility as well. I think that's absolutely incumbent on leaders to take that rather than the individual.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to take one. I feel like people need lubrication, maybe 2 more, and then I think everybody's going to be hanging around afterwards as well when we have a drink. So welcome to come and chat. But there's 2 people over here, I think. No? Okay, 1 person over here. And let me just scan the room in case somebody else was... Okay, let's go with you.
In terms of who under Farrell, this subdivision and Farrell in this country, how does it inclusive leadership and EDI square off with those people? Why aren't those people doing EDI programs?
You're asking why the rich and powerful aren't doing EDI programs?
EDI happens in EDI programs in that global RC organisations, entry level, middle management, ordinary level. White men, a lot of white men are quite eager.
Well, I spend the vast majority of my time in almost exclusive rooms with almost exclusively the men that David was describing earlier from Kent. Not entirely, all Sussex indeed. So I think that is one of the changes that I've seen that Lela was talking about, is that it used to be the EDI program. You came into an organisation at the bottom of the triangle and you had some EDI work, and then that's it, done. Whereas actually some of the most exciting and innovative work that's happening across the globe is at the top level, because as David says, it's a leadership issue. So I think that is a big change for organisations that are taking it seriously. Obviously, if they want to flap around with a half-hour lunch and learn and that's it, then fine. Well, not fine, but there we go. But if they're actually really interested in all the things that we're all talking about, then the work starts at the top. When I'm phoned a phone and someone says there's a terrible thing that's happened, I say, oh yes. Give me your board and then we'll work out where to go from that.
The FTSE 100 doesn't really change, does it, in this country though?
I'm sorry?
The FTSE 100 hasn't really changed.
Well, there was a Davies review in 2011 or 2013. Anyway, more than 10 years ago, there was a Davies review, what referring to that, basically some soft quotas, because you cannot do hard quotas in this country. Whilst in Norway, for example, they have hard quotas. And boards have actually increased to the point that I had to remove it from my teaching material because boards are actually more diverse now. Now, as I was saying earlier on, it doesn't mean that because they're more diverse, the organization becomes more diverse, as the people that go into the board, if the board is not the kind right of place cannot express the diversity, they just have to comply and to turn themselves into prototypes of what they're trying to avoid. So it's a very complex conversation. The last thing I want to say is that it will take a long time, but it's irreversible. So that's what we should actually be absolutely sure
The
about.
country is run by white men.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
where's EDI and all of that?
Well, some men are less white than others. There are right now, but yes.
Let's.
It will change in
I'm going to
And
invite.
done by white men and an Asian man.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely right. It is. You're completely right. And the only really significant question, in my view, is so what are we going to do about it? Otherwise, we don't get out of bed. So I think there has been some progress, not great progress. There's loads to do. However, I think it's important, as Lela said at the beginning, to recognise some of the progress. So you're right, the patterns are still really there, although here is also right, some of them really shifted. The question is, so what are we all going to do about it?
We're not going to put
I think that's another discussion, but my question is, what are we going to do about it? Lots of people focus on what we can't do, and I get it. I'm not naive. What can we do is, I think, a question that I'd like to focus on.
So I'm going to invite everybody to give a last thought. This is a camera, to give a last thought. And I'm going to pose a question, and you're absolutely free to ignore the question and say something else. But the question is, what's next for inclusive leadership? Some of that relates to what we've been talking about. If you want to say something else, which is the burning thing you want to talk about, please do. But just briefly, and then we will socialise.
So I think from a research perspective, one question that I'm really interested in terms of what's next would be, how do we tell whether companies have a genuine commitment to EDI initiatives? Because a few years ago, it was enough to be in the Pride Parade for me to say, oh, this company, wow, they're really putting themselves out there, so they must be a safe place for me to work. But actually now that's not true. And I think it's become much more common for companies to have all the right statements and all the right things to say, but how do you really tell what's going on there? And I think that's, for me at least, a very interesting next question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm not going to give you the scientific question. I have teenage children, and especially I have a teenage daughter who goes to school in Brighton. And I'd get her to interview any new leader that comes. I think they're putting diversified panels, okay, so starting from the thought of her fearlessness in sniffing out anything that goes on. The new generations are really fearless. But I think that diversified panels to hire leaders is a really must, and the diversity has to be a little bit across the board: age, race, gender, whatever else we want to come up with. But that'd be a really interesting social experiment to run.
Thank you.
I think there's something about a paradigm shift. And what I mean by that is, I don't know if you've seen the diagram about equality, equity. Have you seen that diagram?
Yeah.
And have you seen the one that has liberation?
And is that when they're standing on different?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's three people of different heights: grown man, maybe say teenage person, and child. And they're behind the wall, trying to watch a ball game or something. And everybody's on the same level. The grown man can see, the other one can just about peep over, and the child can't see anything. So there's this wall in front. The next picture, that's equality. The next picture is equity, where they've all got, so the grown man hasn't got a box to stand on. The next teenager, say, has a box that's quite high, and the child has a very high wall, so that they're now all seen over the wall, and that's equity. They've all got what they need to see the game. And the final one, which is not always included, is one of liberation, where there is no wall. And everybody is themselves and their height, and they can see and watch the game. And for me, that's where I think inclusion needs to go next. I mean, we by default, people are included by default. We don't need to make special arrangements and give people something in order to include them. That we assume and design for inclusion in the first place, so that I don't even notice. That's just right, everyone experience and enjoy and be themselves without any. Does that make sense?
Make a lot of sense. Thank you, Lela. Dave.
So I think it's focus on the focus should be and can be on what can we do, and one of the ways that we can create change is to build a capacity and understanding of leaders to be able to take account of difference and celebrate it and leverage it. And so in relation to inclusive leadership, focus on what can be done. And it changes the whole conversation, because actually there's so much misery now and forever, and so much awfulness, but that doesn't create change. So for me, it's what can we do to create those organisational cultures where everybody can thrive.
Thanks very much. Some of you may know that I used to be a solicitor, a litigator, equality and human rights lawyer. So I basically sought to advance EDI by suing people. And I really, really enjoyed it enormously. It was great fun. It was great fun. But one of the reasons why I stopped is because you would attain success for individuals, but rarely did you make much more of a systemic change. Sometimes you did, if you're engaged in strategic litigation, which I was. But it wasn't transformative in the way that I think that we would all want. And I've come full circle, and I'm going to pose something slightly Pollyanna-ish or fluffy. And I'm going to say a key thing for inclusive leadership is emotional literacy and building relationships across identities, particularly with people that you don't feel that you're comfortable with. So it picks up on something that Lela was saying earlier. I think that is critical, because we will do a lot without that, but what we will be doing is work against our instincts and our intuition. We'll be trying to say and do the right thing, worrying about the language we're using. Language is very important, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting we should say anything about anybody when it's offensive. But more important than that is relationships and understanding. So I would like to invite us all for a drink. Pardon? In the foyer, thank you. Before that, can I Lela and Jane have come a long way, and Ben and Zahira have given up their time as well. So I invite you to appreciate them in the traditional way.